Stop staring at me. Make it quiet. Make it stop. The words exploded out of Lucas Coleman, as if his body could no longer contain them. His voice was hoarse, jagged, stripped of any filter. It echoed violently across the hotel lobby, bouncing off marble columns and glass walls, turning the very space into an amplifier of his fear. Several guests froze. A man near the concierge desk frowned and shook his head. A woman instinctively covered her child's ears. Someone whispered, sharp and impatient, "This is a 5-star hotel." Lucas didn't hear any of that the way adults heard it. What he heard was everything at once. The hum of the chandelier lights above him drilled into his skull. The clatter of rolling suitcases felt like explosions. Perfume, cologne, cleaning chemicals, scents, layered on top of each other until his chest tightened. Voices overlapped. Shoes clicked. Phones buzzed. Too many signals. Too much input. His brain, wired differently, slammed into overload. "I can't make it stop." Lucas screamed again, clawing at the air as if he could push the sounds away. "It's too fast. Too loud." He bolted forward, then abruptly changed direction. His movements sharp and uncoordinated. His sneakers squealed against the marble floor as he ran in tight, frantic loops. His hands flew up to his ears, then dropped again, then clenched into fists. His breathing became shallow, rapid short gasps that barely reached his lungs. Richard Coleman stood just a few steps away, rooted in place. At 40 years old, Richard had built an empire by mastering chaos. He understood volatility, risk, pressure. He had stared down collapsing markets without blinking, but nothing in his experience prepared him for watching his 6-year-old son unravel in public, powerless to stop it. "Lucas," Richard said, forcing calm into his voice, though his chest was burning. "Hey, buddy, look at me." Lucas didn't look. He couldn't focus long enough to recognize his father's face. His attention ricocheted wildly from the light reflecting off a suitcase wheel, to the echo of his own scream, to the sensation of the cold air brushing his arms. His body felt like it was moving faster than his thoughts, like a car with the accelerator stuck to the floor. "I don't like this," Lucas shouted, dropping suddenly to a crouch and rocking hard. "I don't like it. I want it quiet." A hotel employee took a cautious step forward, then stopped, unsure. The concierge whispered urgently into a headset. A security guard hovered near a pillar, waiting for instructions that hadn't come yet. No one knelt down. No one spoke to Lucas at eye level. Richard felt a familiar, sickening mix of emotions twist inside him. Fear, frustration, and a sharp edge of humiliation he hated himself for feeling. He had warned them. He had explained. He had told the front desk his son had ADHD, that crowds and noise could trigger episodes like this. He had asked for a quiet check-in, but ADHD wasn't visible. And invisible things were easy to dismiss. "Sir," the hotel manager said carefully, approaching Richard instead of the child, "perhaps we should escort your son to a private area until he calms down." Escort, remove, hide. Richard's jaw tightened. "My son is not a disturbance," he said flatly. "He's overwhelmed." Lucas sprang to his feet again, energy surging back in a chaotic wave. He ran straight toward a luggage cart, skidded to a stop at the last second, then spun around, disoriented. The sudden metallic clang as a suitcase shifted sent him over the edge. He screamed high, piercing, raw. A few guests recoiled. Someone muttered, "Unbelievable." Richard stepped forward instinctively, then stopped himself. Every specialist he had ever worked with echoed in his head. "Don't grab him. Don't restrain him. You'll make it worse." So he stood there, helpless, while his son's nervous system misfired in real time. Lucas dropped to the floor again, curling inward, knees to chest, rocking violently. His fingers dug into his hair. His sobs came fast and uneven, the sound of a child drowning in sensation. "Too much," Lucas whimpered. "Daddy, it's too much." That broke something in Richard. He lowered himself halfway, then hesitated, aware of the eyes on him. The judgment. The silent verdicts from people who had never lived a single day inside his son's mind, and still, no one else moved toward Lucas. From the far side of the lobby, Annie saw everything. She had been sitting quietly on a low bench near the wall, her feet swinging back and forth in a slow, steady rhythm. Her backpack rested beside her, faded, frayed, one zipper tooth missing. Inside it were a sandwich her mother had packed and a small notebook filled with uneven drawings. Annie was waiting for her mom to finish her shift. She knew this lobby well. She knew how adults passed by her without seeing her, how her presence blended into the background like the housekeeping carts and the potted plants. She had learned to be patient, to be invisible, but Lucas was impossible to ignore. Annie recognized the signs immediately. The frantic movement, the hands over the ears, the way his body seemed to fight itself. She had seen kids like him at school. She had felt something similar herself on loud days, when the classroom felt too bright and the noise pressed in from all sides. She slid off the bench. Her sneakers barely made a sound as she stepped onto the marble floor. She moved slowly, carefully, the way you approached a frightened animal, no sudden gestures, no loud words. "Hey," a hotel employee hissed sharply when he noticed her. "You shouldn't." Annie stopped but didn't retreat. Richard turned at the sound and saw her approaching his son. A small black girl, thin, quiet, too close. "Don't touch my son," Richard said immediately, his voice edged with fear more than anger. Annie looked up at him, meeting his eyes without flinching. "I won't," she said softly. "I promise." Her voice was calm, unhurried. "I'll just sit." Before anyone could stop her, Annie lowered herself to the floor several feet away from Lucas. She crossed her legs and placed her palms flat against the cold marble, grounding herself. Lucas didn't notice her at first. His brain was still racing, his body still caught in the storm. Annie waited. Then she began to tap her fingers gently against the floor. Tap, 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 tap. Slow, steady, predictable. Not another sound added to the chaos, just a rhythm. Something consistent, something safe. Lucas's rocking stuttered. His sobs broke unevenly. Richard felt his breath catch. "What is she doing?" the manager whispered, alarmed. Richard didn't answer, because Lucas's head tilted slightly. His hands loosened from his ears. His breathing, still fast, began to find a faint rhythm that matched the tapping. Lucas looked up. He saw Annie sitting on the floor, not staring, not judging, not telling him to stop. She wasn't trying to control him. She was simply there. For the first time since the episode began, Lucas hesitated, suspended between panic and possibility. The lobby, with all its wealth and polish and rigid expectations, seemed to fall away. And in its place, on a cold marble floor, one overwhelmed child found another who understood what the world felt like when it became too much. The lobby did not breathe again right away. People remained frozen in place, caught between curiosity and discomfort, unsure whether they were witnessing a crisis or something deeply private. The chandelier still hummed softly above them. The polished marble floor was still cold, but the energy in the room had shifted, subtly yet unmistakably, like a storm losing its grip. Lucas sat on the floor now, no longer rocking violently. His knees were still pulled close to his chest, his shoulders tense, but his screams had dissolved into uneven breaths. His eyes, wide and glassy moments ago, were fixed on Annie's hands as they tapped against the marble. Tap, 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 tap. The rhythm was simple, predictable. It did not rush him. It did not demand anything. Richard watched from only a few steps away, afraid to move, afraid to interrupt whatever fragile balance had formed. He had seen professionals try grounding techniques before weighted blankets, breathing exercises, scripted phrases delivered in calm, clinical voices. None of them had ever worked this quickly, or this quietly. Lucas swallowed hard. "It's still loud," he whispered, his voice thin and strained. Annie nodded once, slow and deliberate, as if acknowledging something important. "I know," she said softly. "You don't have to stop it all at once." As she shifted slightly, careful not to make sudden movements, and tapped again. Same rhythm, same pace. Tap, 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 tap. "You can listen to this instead," she added. Just this. Lucas's breathing hitched, then gradually began to follow the beat. Not perfectly, not right away, but enough. Richard felt his chest tighten painfully. He had memorized charts. He had sat through endless consultations where people talked about his son instead of to him. He had learned how to advocate, how to push, how to pay for the best possible care. No one had ever told him that sometimes what Lucas needed most was not instruction but permission. If this moment moved you, please like this video and leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Your voice matters here. Subscribe to the channel for more stories about truth, compassion, and quiet justice. Around them, the hotel staff shifted uneasily. The concierge took a half step forward, then stopped when the manager subtly raised a hand. A security guard leaned back against a column, uncertain. "Should we intervene?" Someone whispered. "No." Another voice murmured. "Just wait." Annie glanced up briefly, her eyes flicking toward the adults, then back to Lucas. Her expression tightened for just a second, not fear, but awareness. She was used to being watched, used to adults deciding what was best without asking. Lucas wiped his face with the sleeve of his hoodie. His movements were jerky, restless, but no longer explosive. "Are they still looking at me?" he asked. Richard's heart broke at the question. Before he could answer, Annie spoke. "Some are," she said honestly. "But you don't have to look at them." She lifted one hand and pointed gently to the floor between them. "Look here, this spot." Lucas followed her finger. The marble had a faint vein running through it, gray against white, twisting like a small river frozen in stone. "It looks like a lightning bolt," Lucas said quietly. Annie smiled. "Just a little." "Yeah," she said. "I like that kind." Another breath passed, then another. Richard realized he had been holding his own breath without knowing it. He let it out slowly, afraid any sudden movement might shatter the moment. "Thank you," he said softly, though he wasn't sure Annie could hear him. She did, but she didn't look at him. "Sometimes," Annie said to Lucas, "when it gets too much, I pretend I'm smaller than the noise." Lucas frowned. "How?" "I pick one thing," she explained. "One sound, or one picture. And I stay there until the rest gets tired." Lucas thought about that. He tapped his finger once against the floor, then again, mimicking her rhythm. "Tap, tap. It's not gone," he said. "It doesn't have to be," Annie replied. "Just quieter." "Is Dottie?" A few feet away, the manager cleared his throat. "Sir," he said to Richard, his voice measured but tense. "We need to consider the comfort of our other guests." Richard turned slowly, something hard and protective settling into place behind his eyes. "My son is not a disruption," he said quietly. "He's a child having a medical episode." The manager hesitated. "Of course, sir. We understand. But perhaps—" "No," Richard interrupted. Not loudly, not angrily, just firmly. "We're staying right here." There was something in his tone that ended the conversation. The manager nodded stiffly and stepped back. Annie's shoulders relaxed slightly. She had noticed the exchange, even if she pretended not to. Lucas leaned back onto his hands, testing his balance. His movements were still restless, but the frantic edge had dulled. He glanced up at Richard, eyes searching. "Daddy," he said, quieter now. "I don't like when they look at me like that." Richard lowered himself to one knee, careful to stay where he was, not crowding Lucas. "I know," he said. His voice wavered, and he didn't bother hiding it. "I'm sorry." Lucas frowned. "Why?" The question caught Richard off guard. "Because," he began, then stopped. He swallowed hard. "Because I should have helped sooner." Annie finally looked up at him then. Her gaze was not accusatory. It was thoughtful. "Sometimes grown-ups don't know how," she said simply. Richard met her eyes. "You do?" he asked. Annie shrugged. "Sometimes." A woman nearby let out a soft, embarrassed laugh. "Kids," she murmured to her companion. "They surprise you." Annie heard that too. She shifted her weight and glanced toward the elevators, checking instinctively, as if worried her mother might appear and see her sitting on the floor of the lobby. Trouble always came easier to people like them. Lucas followed her gaze. "Are you in trouble?" he asked. Annie shook her head quickly. "No, I'm just waiting." "For who?" "My mom," she said. "She works here." Lucas nodded, accepting this as an important fact. "My dad works everywhere," he said. Annie considered that. "That sounds tiring." Richard almost smiled. A soft chime sounded as an elevator arrived. A few guests stepped out, slowing when they noticed the unusual scene. A well-dressed man kneeling on the floor, his son seated beside a small black girl, all of them framed by expensive marble and silent onlookers. But Lucas didn't react this time. He stayed where he was. Annie tapped the floor one last time, then stopped. "You're doing good," she said. "Your body's catching up." Lucas took a deep breath. Then another. The storm had not disappeared, but it had passed its worst point, And for the first time that evening, Richard allowed himself to believe that this moment, this strange, unplanned moment on a hotel floor, might matter more than any carefully constructed plan he had ever paid for. The quiet held, fragile but real. Lucas sat on the marble floor beside Annie. His legs stretched out now instead of pulled tight to his chest. His hands rested on his knees, fingers twitching occasionally, like they were still deciding whether the danger had truly passed. His breathing wasn't smooth yet, but it was no longer panicked. Each breath had space around it. Tap, tap. Annie tapped twice more, then stopped. Lucas noticed immediately. His head lifted. "Why'd you stop?" he asked, a faint edge of worry creeping back into his voice. Annie smiled at him, small and reassuring. "Because you're doing it yourself now." Lucas blinked. "I am?" She nodded. "You don't need my tapping anymore. Your body figured it out." Lucas tested that idea. He took a slow breath in, then let it out. It felt strange, like balancing on one foot, but it worked. "Oh," he said again, quieter this time. Richard watched the exchange with an ache he couldn't name. He stayed where he was, half kneeling, afraid that standing fully upright would somehow break the spell. He had never seen Lucas calm himself like this, without tools, without instructions, without pressure. The lobby had not returned to normal. Not quite. People still lingered at the edges, pretending to scroll on their phones while sneaking glances. The hotel staff hovered with professional unease, unsure whether this moment would end in relief or complaint. Lucas glanced up at Annie again, studying her face as if really seeing her for the first time. "What's your name?" he asked. Annie hesitated. It was a small pause. Most people wouldn't have noticed it, but Richard did. It was the pause of a child who had learned that names could invite questions, and questions could invite trouble. "Still," she answered. "My name's Annie," she said. Lucas smiled immediately, like the answer pleased him more than he'd expected. "I'm Lucas. I know," Annie replied. Lucas looked surprised. "You do?" "Your dad kept saying it," she said matter-of-factly. Richard felt a flicker of embarrassment. He opened his mouth to apologize for not introducing them properly, then stopped. Annie didn't seem offended. If anything, she seemed used to adults forgetting the formalities when it came to children like her. "I like your name," Lucas said. Annie considered that. "I like yours too." "What does Annie mean?" Lucas asked. She shrugged. "My mom says it means grace. I don't really know what that is." Lucas thought hard. "Is it like when you don't get mad, even though you could?" Annie's eyes softened. "Yeah," she said. "I think it's like that." Richard felt his throat tighten. A woman near the elevators whispered to her husband, "That little girl is something else." Annie heard it. She always heard it. Her shoulders tensed slightly, the instinct to retreat flickering again. Lucas noticed. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I'm fine," Annie said quickly. "You're not shaking anymore," Lucas observed. Annie looked at her hands, then back at him. "I don't shake like you do," she said gently. "But sometimes my stomach feels twisty when people look." Lucas nodded seriously. "My chest feels like it's buzzing." "That too," Annie said. "Buzzing is bad." Richard shifted his weight, the word people look echoing in his mind. He saw, suddenly, how familiar this was to her. How practiced. How unfair. "Annie," he said carefully, testing her name aloud for the first time. "Thank you." She looked up at him. Really looked. "For what?" she asked. "For seeing my son," Richard said. "Not the noise. Him." Annie studied his face, weighing something silently. "I always see kids first," she said. "Grown-ups don't like that." Richard let out a quiet, humorless breath. "They should." Lucas leaned closer to Annie, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "Do you come here a lot?" "Every week," she said. "My mom works." Lucas nodded. "My dad works everywhere." Annie smiled at that, a little crooked. "That sounds lonely." Richard almost laughed, then stopped himself when he realized she wasn't joking. Before he could respond, a hotel manager approached again, his expression carefully neutral. "Sir," he said to Richard, "we've received complaints." Richard stood up slowly this time, fully, his posture straight but controlled. "My son had a medical episode," he repeated. "He is recovering. If that's a problem, we'll remember it." The manager hesitated, then nodded stiffly. "Of course, sir." As he stepped away, Annie exhaled quietly, a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "You don't have to do that," she said to Richard. "Do what?" "Get mad at them," she said. "They always do that." Richard crouched again so he was level with her. "I'm not mad," he said. "I'm done pretending it's okay." "Actually," Annie tilted her head, considering him. "That's different." "Yes," Richard said. "It is." A familiar squeak echoed from across the lobby, the wheels of a housekeeping cart. Annie's head snapped up. "My mom," she said, already rising to her feet. A woman in a light blue uniform approached, slowing when she saw her daughter standing with a well-dressed man and a child seated on the floor. Fear crossed her face instantly. "Annie?" she said softly but urgently. "What are you doing?" Annie straightened. "I was helping." Her mother's eyes flicked to Lucas, then to Richard. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "She knows she's not supposed to." "She helped my son," Richard interrupted gently. "She helped him more than anyone else." The woman froze. Lucas stood up too, wobbling slightly before steadying himself. "She helped me," he said. "I was buzzing." Annie's mother looked down at her daughter, then back at Lucas. Something softened in her expression, pride mixing with caution. "We should go," she said to Annie, not unkindly. "My break's almost over." Annie nodded, then turned back to Lucas. "It was nice to meet you," she said. "Lucas." He clutched the small cleaning cloth she had given him earlier, fingers curling around it. "It was nice to meet you too," he said. Annie, hearing her name from him, made her smile. As Annie walked away with her mother, disappearing into the rhythm of the hotel's back corridors, Richard felt an unfamiliar certainty settle in his chest. Lucas watched her until she was gone. "She didn't think I was bad," he said quietly. Richard knelt in front of him, resting his hands on his son's shoulders. "No," he said. "She didn't. I teens with 2000. And for the first time, Richard wondered how many times the world had failed that little girl, and how many times she had learned to carry grace anyway. The lobby slowly returned to motion. But it was not the same motion as before. People resumed walking, voices lowered. Suitcases rolled again across the marble floor. Yet something lingered in the air. An aftertaste of discomfort mixed with quiet awe. A few guests stole glances at Lucas as they passed, but most of them looked away faster than before, as if suddenly aware of their own staring. Lucas stood close to his father now, the small cleaning cloth Annie had given him clenched in his fist. He rubbed it between his fingers, back and forth, grounding himself in the texture. The buzzing in his chest had not disappeared completely, but it had softened, like a storm moving farther out to sea. Richard straightened his jacket, a reflex more than a necessity. He felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with appearances. For the first time in a long while, people had seen something he usually managed to contain behind closed doors. They had seen his son. "Are we leaving?" Lucas asked quietly. Richard looked down at him. "Do you want to?" Lucas hesitated. He glanced toward the elevators, then toward the long stretch of windows that looked out onto the city street. Cars moved below, their headlights blinking on as dusk crept in. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I'm tired." Richard nodded. "That makes sense." He placed a gentle hand on Lucas's shoulder. Not gripping, not guiding, just there. Lucas leaned into the touch without thinking, his body accepting it, now that the danger had passed. They began walking slowly toward a quieter seating area near the windows. With each step, Richard noticed how carefully his son moved, as if testing the world to see whether it would suddenly grow too loud again. A bellhop passed by and offered a polite nod, his eyes flicking briefly to Lucas's hands, then away. No comment. No judgment spoken aloud. That, Richard realized, was progress, however small. They reached a pair of low chairs set slightly apart from the main flow of traffic. Richard sat, and Lucas climbed up beside him, curling his legs underneath himself. Outside, the city hummed in the distance, a sound softened by thick glass. Richard exhaled slowly. He had handled mergers that reshaped entire industries. He had negotiated contracts worth more money than he could ever spend in a lifetime. None of that had prepared him for the way his hands were still trembling now. "Daddy?" Lucas asked. "Yes." Was I bad? The question was quiet, careful, the kind of question that carried old weight. Richard felt it land squarely in his chest. "No," he said immediately. "You were overwhelmed." Lucas frowned. "People don't like it when I'm like that." Today, Richard chose his words carefully. Some people don't understand it, and some people are afraid of things they don't understand. Lucas looked down at the cloth in his hand. Annie wasn't afraid. No, Richard agreed. She wasn't. Lucas was silent for a moment, then asked, "Will I see her again?" The question caught Richard off guard. "I don't know," he admitted. "But maybe." Lucas nodded, accepting the uncertainty. He rubbed the cloth once more, then tucked it carefully into the pocket of his hoodie. Richard leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting to the reflection of them both in the window. He barely recognized the man staring back at him, not because he looked different, but because something inside him had shifted. For years, he had treated Lucas's condition like a problem to be solved, something to manage, to minimize, to keep from disrupting carefully curated environments. He had paid experts to help him build walls around his son's differences, and then a 6-year-old girl, sitting on a marble floor, had dismantled those walls without even trying. Richard closed his eyes briefly. He thought of Annie's calm voice, her certainty, the way she had seen Lucas not as a spectacle, but as a child fighting something invisible. How many times had she done that before? How many times had she learned to read people's pain because no one ever slowed down to read hers? A memory surfaced uninvited, his own childhood, sitting stiffly beside his father at formal dinners, learning early that discomfort was weakness and emotions were liabilities. He had learned to swallow everything that didn't fit the image. Lucas, he realized, had never been given that option. His emotions refused to be swallowed. They demanded space, and maybe that wasn't a flaw. A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "Sir." Richard opened his eyes to see the hotel manager standing a respectful distance away, hands clasped in front of him. His expression was carefully neutral, but something like caution flickered beneath it. "Yes?" Richard said. "I wanted to apologize," the manager began, "for how the situation was handled earlier." Richard studied him. "Go on." Reported, "We aim to provide a comfortable environment for all our guests," the manager said. "And sometimes, we focus too much on appearances." Richard didn't respond right away. "My son isn't an appearance," he said finally. "He's a person." The manager nodded, his jaw tightening slightly. "Understood." After a brief pause, he added, "If there's anything you need, a quieter area, assistance, we're fine," Richard said. "But thank you." The manager inclined his head and walked away. Lucas watched him go. He was nicer that time. He was. Richard agreed. Lucas leaned back against the chair. "Annie said grown-ups don't know how sometimes." Richard let out a short, surprised laugh. She might be right. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the city lights growing brighter outside as evening settled in. Richard checked his watch absently, then realized it no longer mattered what time it was. What mattered was the boy beside him, calmer now, present, and the girl who had made that possible. Across the lobby, unseen by most, Annie and her mother disappeared into the service elevator. The doors slid shut quietly, carrying them upward, back into a world that rarely noticed when they moved through it. But Richard noticed, and he knew, with a certainty that unsettled him, that this encounter was not something he would forget or allow to fade into a story told once and set aside. It was a beginning. That night, Lucas slept with the lights on. Richard noticed it only after he had finished changing into his pajamas and was halfway through pulling the blanket up to his son's chin. The bedside lamp cast a soft yellow glow across the room, catching on the edges of the furniture, turning shadows into gentle shapes instead of threats. "You want me to turn it off?" Richard asked quietly. Lucas shook his head, already clutching the worn cleaning cloth in one hand. "Can it stay on?" "Of course," Richard said without hesitation. He sat on the edge of the bed longer than usual, listening to the rhythm of Lucas's breathing as it gradually slowed. The hotel room was silent in a way the lobby never had been. Thick carpets, heavy curtains, insulation designed to keep the outside world at bay. This was the kind of quiet Richard had paid for countless times, and yet, his mind refused to settle. As Lucas drifted towards sleep, his eyes fluttering closed and open again, he murmured, "Daddy?" "Yes, buddy. Annie's name means grace," Lucas said. "That's a good name." Richard smiled faintly. "It is." Lucas nodded, satisfied, and finally fell asleep, the cloth tucked beneath his chin like a talisman. Richard stayed there, watching his son, until the rise and fall of his chest evened out completely. Only then did he stand and move toward the window. Outside, The city stretched endlessly, lights blinking, traffic flowing, people moving with purpose toward destinations that felt suddenly irrelevant. He pressed his forehead lightly against the cool glass. He had replayed the scene in the lobby over and over since it happened. Lucas's screams, the staring, his own paralysis, and then Annie, stepping forward without fear, without permission. A 6-year-old girl had done what years of experience, training, and money had not. Richard's phone buzzed softly on the nightstand. He glanced at the screen. 3 missed messages from his assistant. 2 emails flagged urgent. A reminder for a call with investors in the morning. He silenced it. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the usual anxiety that followed such a decision. The world could wait a few hours. His son could not. The next morning, Richard woke early. He moved quietly through the suite, careful not to disturb Lucas, and made himself a cup of coffee using the small machine near the kitchenette. The bitter smell grounded him. He stood there, mug in hand, staring at nothing, when a thought surfaced that made him pause. He didn't know Annie's last name. He didn't know where she lived, what school she went to, or how often she sat on benches waiting for her mother to finish cleaning rooms in buildings like this one, and that felt wrong. When Lucas woke, he was groggy but calm. The meltdown from the night before seemed distant now, like a bad dream that still left a faint ache behind. "Did I scare you?" Lucas asked as they ate breakfast, scrambled eggs for him, untouched toast for Richard. Richard set his fork down. "No," he said honestly. "You worried me. But you didn't scare me." Lucas poked at his eggs. "People looked at me like I was scary." Richard nodded slowly. "Sometimes people mistake things they don't understand for danger." Lucas frowned. "Is Annie dangerous?" "No," Richard said firmly. "Annie is brave." Lucas smiled at that. After breakfast, Richard made a decision that surprised even himself. "Do you want to go downstairs?" he asked. Lucas froze. "The lobby?" "Yes," Richard said gently. "We don't have to stay long, and we can leave any time you want." Lucas hesitated, fingers tightening around the cloth in his pocket. "What if it gets loud again?" "Then we'll handle it," Richard replied. Together, they took the elevator down mid-morning, when the lobby was quieter than the night before but still alive. As the doors slid open, Lucas stiffened, then took a careful breath. "I'm okay," he said, more to himself than to Richard. Richard let him lead the way out. The lobby looked the same, polished, pristine, indifferent. But Richard felt different moving through it now. More aware, less insulated. He scanned the room instinctively, searching for a small figure near the walls. A worn backpack, familiar braids. Nothing. "Daddy," Lucas said softly. "She's not here." Richard nodded. "She might be working somewhere else today." Lucas absorbed that quietly. They sat near the windows again. Not because Richard needed the quiet, but because it felt like the right place. A few guests passed by. Some glanced at Lucas. Most didn't. "Progress," Richard thought again. A woman pushing a housekeeping cart moved across the far side of the lobby. Richard's attention sharpened immediately, though he knew better than to jump to conclusions. When she turned, he saw that it wasn't Annie's mother. Disappointment surprised him with its force. He was still processing that feeling when a voice behind him said, "Sir?" Richard turned. It was the concierge from the night before, his posture polite but cautious. "I spoke with my supervisor," the man said. "About yesterday." Richard waited. "We wanted to let you know that we're reviewing our staff training," the concierge continued, "especially regarding guests with special needs." Richard studied him. "Why?" The man shifted slightly. "Because what happened yesterday shouldn't have escalated the way it did." Richard thought of Annie sitting on the floor, calm and steady, while trained adults stood frozen. "That's a start," he said. The concierge nodded, relieved, and moved away. Lucas watched the exchange. "Are they learning?" he asked. "I hope so," Richard replied. They stayed in the lobby longer than Richard had planned, not because Lucas needed to acclimate, but because Richard needed to observe. He noticed how easily the environment dismissed certain people and elevated others, how invisible labor kept everything running, how children like Annie learned early to read rooms adults never questioned. He felt a quiet anger settle beneath his ribs, not explosive, not loud, but focused. This wasn't just about his son. It never had been. As they prepared to leave for the day, Lucas tugged on his sleeve. "Daddy," Yes? If I see Annie again, Lucas said, serious. I want to say thank you better. Richard smiled. I think she already knows. Lucas shook his head. I want to tell her my name again, so she doesn't forget. Richard felt something twist warmly in his chest. She won't forget you, he said, but he already knew the truth. Neither would he. The afternoon light slanted through the hotel windows, softening the sharp lines of the lobby. Dust motes floated lazily in the air, visible only where the sun caught them just right. From his seat near the glass, Richard watched people come and go, business travelers with rolling suitcases, couples dressed for lunch, staff moving with practiced efficiency. Lucas sat beside him, swinging his legs gently, the cleaning cloth still tucked safely into his pocket. He wasn't gripping it anymore. That, Richard noticed, felt like progress. You're doing really well, Richard said. Lucas shrugged. It's quieter now. Yes, Richard agreed. It is. They stayed a little longer than planned. Not because Lucas needed more time, but because Richard did. He was beginning to see the lobby not as a polished space designed for comfort, but as a stage where invisible rules decided who belonged and who didn't. A bell chimed as the service elevator opened on the far side of the room. Richard's attention sharpened immediately. Annie stepped out first, her small backpack slung over one shoulder. She looked tired now, the calm confidence from the night before, replaced with the subdued patience of a child who had spent hours waiting quietly. Behind her came her mother, pushing a housekeeping cart, her shoulders slightly hunched from long hours of work. Lucas noticed her at the same time. Daddy, he whispered urgently. It's Annie. Richard stood without thinking. For a brief second, Annie didn't see them. She was focused on tying one loose strap on her backpack, her brow furrowed in concentration. When she finally looked up and spotted Lucas, her face changed instantly, surprise flickering into a shy smile. Hi, she said. Lucas froze, then remembered himself. He straightened, heart pounding, and took a step forward. Hi, he said back. I wanted to say thank you again. Annie nodded, as if this were a perfectly reasonable thing to say. You're welcome. Her mother noticed them now, her expression tightening with instinctive concern. Annie, she said softly. We need to keep moving. It's okay, Richard said quickly, careful to keep his voice respectful, non-threatening. I just wanted to thank your daughter properly. Annie's mother studied him for a moment, the expensive suit, the controlled posture, the practiced calm, and then looked down at her daughter. What did you do, sweetheart? She asked gently. Annie shifted her weight. I helped him breathe, she said simply. Lucas nodded eagerly. She did. She helped my brain slow down. Annie's mother blinked, clearly unsure how to respond. Richard stepped closer, lowering himself slightly so he wasn't towering over them. My name is Richard Coleman, he said. This is my son, Lucas. Annie's mother hesitated, then nodded. I'm Maria, she said. This is my daughter, Annie. I know, Richard said with a small smile. She introduced herself yesterday. Maria's eyebrows lifted in surprise. She has a gift, Richard continued. And I don't say that lightly. Maria's instinct was to deflect. Years of experience had taught her that praise from people like this often came with expectations or consequences. She's just a kid, Maria said carefully. So is my son, Richard replied. And yesterday, she treated him like one when the rest of us failed to. Things were munted. Maria looked down at Annie. Something complicated moving behind her eyes, pride, worry, protectiveness. Annie tugged lightly on her mother's sleeve. Mama, it's okay, she said. They're nice. Maria sighed quietly. We're on our way out, she said to Richard. My shift just ended. Richard nodded. Of course, I won't keep you. Lucas glanced between them, then blurted out. Can I give her something? Richard looked down at him. What did you have in mind? Lucas reached into his pocket and pulled out the cleaning cloth. He hesitated, then held it out toward Annie. You gave this to me, he said. It helped. I want you to have something too, but I don't really have anything. Annie looked at the cloth, then back at Lucas. She shook her head gently. You keep it, she said. It's yours now. Lucas frowned, thinking hard. Then his eyes brightened. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small plastic race car blue, chipped along one side, clearly well loved. This is my favorite, he said seriously. It goes really fast, but sometimes it needs to stop. Annie smiled. touched despite herself. That sounds like you. He grinned. Yeah. She took the car carefully, turning it over in her hands. Thank you. Maria's throat tightened as she watched the exchange. She placed a hand on Annie's shoulder. We really should go, she said softly. Before they turned away, Richard spoke again. Maria, he said, if it's all right, I'd like to talk sometime. About Annie, about what she did. Maria stiffened. She didn't do anything wrong. I know, Richard said quickly. That's not what I mean. He paused, choosing his words with care. I spend a lot of time around people who believe solutions come from titles and training, he continued. Yesterday, your daughter reminded me that understanding doesn't always come from either. Maria studied him for a long moment. You don't have to fix everything, she said finally. Sometimes kids just need someone to see them. Richard nodded. I'm starting to understand that. Annie tugged gently on her mother's hand. Can we go now? Yes, baby, Maria said. As they turned to leave, Lucas called out. Annie? She looked back. I won't forget your name, he said earnestly. Annie smiled, her eyes warm. I won't forget yours either, Lucas. They walked away together. Annie's small hand tucked into her mother's, the blue race car peeking out from her fingers. Richard watched until they disappeared through the revolving doors. Lucas leaned against him, quiet now, thoughtful. She's my friend, he said. Richard rested a hand on his son's head. Yes, he said. She is. And as they stood there, father and son framed by glass and light, Richard felt certain of one thing. This was no longer just a chance encounter. It was the beginning of a responsibility he could not, and would not, walk away from. The drive away from the hotel was quiet. Not the uneasy silence Richard had grown accustomed to after difficult moments, but a thoughtful one, like both of them were still holding something fragile, afraid that speaking too loudly might break it. Lucas sat in the back seat, his sneakers kicked off, knees pulled up loosely as he watched the city slide past the window. The blue race car Annie had given him rested in his lap. He rolled it back and forth along the seam of the seat, slow and deliberate. Daddy, he said after a while. Yes? Do you think Annie gets tired of helping people? The question caught Richard off guard. I don't know, he admitted. Why do you ask? Lucas shrugged. She helps like it's normal, but it looks like work. Richard tightened his grip on the steering wheel, the observation landing heavier than he expected. Sometimes, he said carefully, people learn to help because no one helped them first. Lucas thought about that. That doesn't seem fair. No, Richard said. It isn't. They stopped at a red light. Richard glanced at his reflection in the rearview mirror. His own eyes looked older somehow. Not tired. Awake. He dropped Lucas off at home with the sitter and drove straight to his office downtown, though his heart wasn't in it. The building rose clean and sharp against the sky, glass and steel reflecting authority. Normally, stepping inside grounded him. Today, it felt hollow. Mr. Coleman? His assistant greeted him as he stepped off the elevator. We need your approval on the Boston acquisition, and the board call has been moved up to cancel it, Richard said. She blinked. Sir, postpone it, he corrected. Tell them I'll reschedule. A pause. Is everything all right? Richard thought of Annie sitting on the marble floor, of Maria's instinctive fear, of how easily a child had been dismissed, and how easily he himself had once dismissed people like her. No, he said honestly. But it will be. He went into his office and closed the door. For a long moment, he stood there, staring out at the city. Then, he pressed the intercom. Can you get me the hotel's HR policies? He asked his assistant, specifically regarding staff children on site. Another pause. I'll look into it. And one more thing, Richard added. I need the name of the cleaning supervisor on the evening shift. His assistant hesitated. May I ask why? Because, Richard said, his voice steady. I think we need to talk about who gets protected and who doesn't. That evening, after Lucas was asleep, Richard sat alone at the kitchen table, a legal pad in front of him. He hadn't written on paper in years, everything lived on screens now, but this felt like something that needed weight. He wrote Annie at the top of the page, then Maria, then, slowly, deliberately, he began listing questions instead of solutions. What happens to children who grow up watching their parents disappear into service elevators? Who teaches them emotional intelligence when no one has time to teach them safety? How many Annies learn to be calm because chaos is not an option? He set the pen down, unsettled. For years, he had donated millions to education initiatives, mental health programs, innovation hubs. He had believed that scale was the answer, that impact came from size. And yet, the most meaningful intervention he had witnessed all year had cost nothing. No grant, no committee, no approval, just attention. The next morning, Richard walked Lucas to school himself. It wasn't something he usually did. Schedules, drivers, meetings, it was easier to delegate. But when Lucas reached for his hand at the crosswalk, Richard felt a quiet conviction settle in his chest. "You're holding my hand too tight," Lucas said. Richard loosened his grip immediately. "Sorry. Axes." "It's okay," Lucas said. "Just don't squeeze." "I won't," Richard promised. At school pickup that afternoon, Lucas climbed into the car buzzing with stories about a science experiment, about a classmate who talked too much, about how his teacher said race cars needed brakes. Richard listened more than he spoke. When they got home, Lucas surprised him. "Daddy," he said, "can Annie come over someday?" The question was casual, but the hope beneath it was unmistakable. "I don't know," Richard said honestly. "But if she can, I'd like that." Lucas nodded, satisfied. That night, after Lucas went to bed, Richard made a call he had been putting off for years. "David," a familiar voice answered. "What's this about?" "Mark," Richard said. "I need a favor." A pause. "That depends. I want to review our philanthropic portfolio," Richard continued. "Specifically, where it intersects with labor, childcare, and special needs." Mark exhaled slowly. "That's broad." "So is the problem," Richard replied. Another pause. Then, what happened? Richard thought of Annie again. Of her calm voice. Of the way she had said, "I always see kids first." "I met someone who reminded me what we keep missing," he said. The next day, Richard returned to the hotel alone. He dressed down, no tie, no watch that screamed money. It wasn't disguise. It was intention. The lobby looked the same. It always would. But Richard walked through it differently now, noticing things he had once filtered out. The tired eyes behind polite smiles, the subtle way staff avoided being noticed, the unspoken hierarchy that decided who could sit and who could not. He asked for the cleaning supervisor. The woman who came forward looked wary, her posture already defensive. "I just want to talk," Richard said gently. "No one's in trouble." She didn't look convinced, but she nodded. "My name is Richard Coleman," he said. "I was here a few nights ago, with my son." Recognition flickered across her face. "I wanted to ask about one of your employees," Richard continued. "Maria, and her daughter." The supervisor's shoulders tightened. "She didn't break any rules," she said quickly. "Her daughter was just waiting." "I know," Richard interrupted. "And I think that matters." The woman studied him carefully now. "What are you asking, sir?" Richard chose his words with care. "I'm asking what it would take," he said, "to make sure a child like Annie doesn't have to learn calm before she learns safety." The supervisor didn't answer right away, but she didn't walk away either. And Richard knew, with quiet certainty, that whatever came next would not be easy, but it would be necessary. Richard did not announce himself when he entered the hotel that afternoon. He stood just inside the revolving doors for a moment, letting the space absorb him instead of the other way around. The lobby was busier than it had been the day before. Conference guests clustered near the bar. A wedding party drifted past in coordinated outfits, laughter spilling louder than it should have in a place designed to sound expensive. No one screamed this time. No one stared. And yet, Richard felt the same unease crawl up his spine. He adjusted the collar of his open shirt, not designer casual, just deliberately plain, and scanned the room with a different set of eyes than he once